The United States Secretary of Defense stood at a podium in front of the American press corps and, without notes, without apparent embarrassment, and without a correctly fitting jacket, quoted Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction and presented it as scripture. Not as a joke, as a prayer. The passage he recited, "The path of the downed aviator is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. And you will know my call sign is Sandy 1, when I lay my vengeance upon thee," is not from the book of Ezekiel. It is not from any book in the King James Bible, the New International Version, or any translation that has ever existed in any language on any continent. It is from a 1994 Miramax crime film in which John Travolta shoots heroin and gets stabbed in the heart with an adrenaline needle. That is the sacred text that the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America delivered, with apparent sincerity, to a room full of military personnel. He called it Caesar 25-17. Ezekiel 25-17 simply reads, "I will carry out great vengeance on them and punish them in my wrath." 7 words, clean, comprehensible, biblically sourced. Pete Hegseth did not say those words. And somehow, that was not even the most alarming thing he did that week. Cartman just stared at the screen and said, "Dude, even I wouldn't do that." The question this video is going to answer is not how this happened. The question is, what kind of system produces a moment like this, decides it is fine, and then asks for $1.5 trillion? Let's set the scene properly. Just days before Hegseth's press conference, President Trump had posted an image online that appeared to portray him as Jesus Christ. Not subtly, not metaphorically, an image of Trump as Jesus. Posted without caption or explanation to tens of millions of followers, the image was eventually deleted. Trump, when asked, said, and this is a direct quote, "I thought I was a doctor," which is either a statement about the image being digitally altered, a genuine confusion about the word doctored, or a sentence that simply does not mean anything. Depending on which interpretation you prefer, it ranges from clever to concerning to a third category that doesn't have a name yet. Any reasonable administration, having just weathered public backlash over its leader being visually presented as the Son of God, would spend the following week being somewhat careful about the Jesus comparisons. Dialing it back, issuing a statement that says, "We understand the optics," telling the Secretary of Defense to keep the theology to a minimum at the press briefing. That is not what happened. What happened instead was that Pete Hegseth appeared before the press corps to deliver what was supposed to be a routine update on American military operations and used the occasion to explain that the members of the press are Dajan, in his view, spiritually equivalent to the Pharisees, the ones who tried to destroy Jesus. He had been in church that Sunday, he explained, and when the minister read from the book of Mark, chapter 3, the passage in which Jesus heals a man's withered hand on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees, watching, plot to destroy him, Hegseth had an epiphany. He said, and this is a direct quote, "I sat there in church and I thought, our press are just like these Pharisees. Let us follow this analogy carefully," because Hegseth was following it carefully. The Pharisees in that passage are watching Jesus perform a miracle and plotting against him anyway, because their hearts are hardened. Hegseth applied this directly. The press are the Pharisees, watching and questioning, which means Trump is Jesus, performing the miracle. The miracle, in this case, being the Iran military operation in which people were killed. So the Secretary of Defense stood before the American press corps and, using Sunday church as his spiritual source material, argued that questioning the president's decision to conduct airstrikes is morally equivalent to plotting to destroy the Son of God, and that the press should feel ashamed. The detail that most coverage moved past quickly was this. Hegseth then said, "Sometimes it's hard to figure out what side some of you are actually on." He said that about American journalists at a government press briefing, about journalists whose constitutional function is explicitly to be on no administration's side. He said it out loud, on camera, to their faces, and moved on. Then, at a separate event that same week, Hegseth delivered what he introduced as a prayer. He called it Caesar 25-17. He led the room in reciting it. The room recited it. The prayer, in its entirety, is the famous monologue delivered by Jules Winfield, a fictional hitman played by Samuel L. Jackson, before executing someone in a low-rent apartment in Pulp Fiction. Nobody in that room stopped him. Here is what makes this more than a gaffe reel. Trump posting himself as Jesus was not a random decision. Hegseth responding to the backlash not by retreating, but by doubling, by spelling out the theological logic that the image implied was not a communications failure. These are connected behaviors, and they form a coherent pattern worth naming precisely. This administration has decided, apparently as a deliberate strategic choice, that framing the presidency in explicitly messianic terms is useful. The backlash is not a problem to be managed, it is a feature. Every time a critic objects to the Jesus imagery, the base sees a Pharisee. The criticism confirms the narrative. The outrage is the point. This is not a new playbook. What is new is how far it has traveled up the institutional chain. It is one thing for an anonymous account to post Trump as Jesus fan art. It is a structurally different thing when the Secretary of Defense, a cabinet official, Senate confirmed, standing at the official Department of Defense podium, does the exegesis for you. He is not a fringe figure saying fringe things. He is the person who controls the world's largest military institution, explaining that journalists who question military strikes are the spiritual enemies of Jesus Christ. The same week all of this was happening, the Pope was still standing at his own podium quoting the actual Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. He was not making a political statement. He was reading the Beatitudes. The response from this administration was to freeze millions in Catholic Church charitable funding and frame the Pope's call for peace as an attack on the president. This is the same administration now claiming that the press corps, by asking questions, is betraying the divine. The Pulp Fiction prayer is, in this context, not just embarrassing. It is revealing. Someone wrote that prayer. Someone put it in Hegseth's speech. Someone at some point in the preparation process read the phrase, "You will know my call sign is Sandy 1 when I lay my vengeance upon thee," and thought, yes, this is appropriate for the Secretary of Defense to deliver at a military event. That person still works there, nobody was fired, nobody issued a correction, the event continued. Kyle looked at the clip, looked at the budget numbers on the table, and said, dude, that's not a policy, that's a religion. And here is the detail that ties the theological claims to the policy claims. The same week, Hegseth was explaining that questioning military action is spiritually equivalent to opposing Jesus. The White House released a proposed budget calling for $1.5 trillion in military spending for a single year. Not over a decade. 1 year. $1.5 trillion. To understand what that number means, consider this. The entire budget of USAID, the foreign aid agency that was gutted in the first weeks of this administration, whose elimination is projected to cost millions of lives through discontinued disease treatment and food assistance programs, globally was $35.4 billion. That is approximately 0.3% of federal spending. It was eliminated because the argument went, there was no money. The same budget that eliminated it is now requesting $500 billion more than the previous year's already trillion-dollar military allocation. China, which has the second largest military in the world and roughly 4 times America's population, spends $300 billion annually on defense. Russia, currently fighting a land war in Europe, spends $150 billion. India, with 1.4 billion people, spends $86 billion. If you combine the military budgets of the 9 next largest armed forces on Earth, you still fall well short of what the United States already spent before this proposal. The new request would bring American military spending to approximately the same level as every other country on the planet combined. This is the context in which Pete Hegseth is telling the press they should be on their knees. The administration's own side did what the administration's own side does. They treated the Pulp Fiction incident as though it had not occurred and leaned harder into the theology. The Jesus imagery was not retracted. The press conference framing was not walked back. Lindsey Graham appeared on television to discuss the military budget proposal and described it as, in his words, the budget I've been dreaming of. He was visibly transported. He said this is what he thinks about. He did not clarify the specific circumstances under which he thinks about it, but the implication was that the $1.5 trillion figure produces in him a specific and personal form of fulfillment. Nobody on the panel asked a follow-up question. The opposition reacted with the moral clarity and practical effectiveness that has come to define the opposition's approach to this era of governance. Senator Patty Murray appeared on camera to say that the money should go to schools and bridges instead of missiles. This is correct. It also changes nothing, and everyone involved knows it. The statement was made, "It will appear in the record." That is the function it serves. Internationally, the press covered the Pulp Fiction prayer with an energy that suggested they were both appalled and genuinely unsure how to report it straight-faced. Allied governments, many of which have navigated their own diplomatic friction with this administration in recent months, processed the moment quietly and said very little. The Pope continued calling for peace. Funding to Catholic charities continued to be frozen. The world watched and made a note of it, somewhere in a file that is growing quite thick. On social media, the clip of Hegseth reciting the Pulp Fiction passage circulated alongside the original Samuel L. Jackson scene. The juxtaposition required no editing, no commentary, and no setup. Just the two clips, back to back. It got millions of views. The comments were largely people asking whether it was real. It was real. And ordinary people, people outside the political bubble, people who are not paid to have opinions about this, processed it the way ordinary people tend to process things that don't quite compute. They watched the clip, they watched it again, they sent it to someone they knew, they said, "Is this real?" And then they went back to their lives. Because the alternative is to sit with the full weight of what it means that the Secretary of Defense of the United States quoted Pulp Fiction as a prayer and nobody in the room corrected him, and that is not something most people have the bandwidth to fully absorb on a Tuesday. Here is what this moment actually reveals, stripped of the noise. The messianic framing is not incidental to this administration's politics. It is load-bearing. When you construct a political identity around the idea that one man is divinely chosen, that questioning him is not just wrong but sacrilegious, that the press are not adversaries but Pharisees, that peace advocates are enemies and war critics are betrayers, you have moved past the territory of normal political argument. Normal political argument can be countered with facts, with elections, with institutions. What Hegseth was describing at that press conference is a framework in which none of those things apply. You cannot fact-check a miracle. You cannot vote out Jesus. You cannot hold the divine accountable through a congressional subcommittee. That is the framework this administration is actively building, in public, on camera, with a straight face. And the military budget is not separate from this framework. It is an expression of it. A $1.5 trillion military budget, larger than the combined defense spending of every other nation on Earth, is not a policy position. It is a statement about what is beyond question. It is the physical manifestation of the theological claim. You cannot ask whether this is necessary. You cannot run the cost-benefit analysis. That would make you a Pharisee. Meanwhile, the $35.4 billion that kept people alive in 50 countries around the world, that built relationships with governments, that extended American influence without a single bomb that was easy to cut, that was 0.3% of federal spending, that was the kind of thing that could be questioned, because nobody was claiming it was sacred. The system that produces moments like this is not broken. It is working exactly as the people running it intend. The chaos, the theological theater, the Pulp Fiction prayer, these are not bugs. They are the atmosphere. They keep the conversation on their terms. While everyone is discussing whether Pete Hegseth knows the difference between Ezekiel and Quentin Tarantino, the budget moves forward. While everyone is debating the Jesus imagery, the aid programs stay cut. The spectacle is the strategy. This is not unique to this administration. Every administration produces its own version of the spectacle. What varies is the content and the intensity. What stays constant is the function. Keep the public looking at the performance while the decisions are made elsewhere, by people who are not performing. The difference here is that the performance has acquired a theological dimension that most American administrations have had the instinct, or at least the caution, to avoid making this explicit. Most politicians invoke God as a footnote. This one is making it the premise. Here is where we land. Pete Hegseth stood at a Department of Defense podium and told the press they should be ashamed for not cheering loudly enough. He compared the president to Jesus. He quoted Pulp Fiction as scripture. He did all of this in the same week the administration proposed a military budget larger than the rest of the world combined and eliminated a foreign aid program that cost less than 0.33% of federal spending. And the question that lingers, the one that does not have a satisfying answer, is not why he did it. The answer to that is obvious. He did it because it works. It works on the base. It works as a media strategy. It works as a way of defining the boundaries of acceptable criticism, because once you have framed the president as Jesus, anyone who criticizes the president has told you which side of the story they're on. The question is what you do with a system that rewards this. Not a party, not a man, a system. Because the system does not care about the theology. The system does not care about Pulp Fiction or the Beatitudes or the size of Hegseth's jacket button. The system cares about power. And right now, this is what power sounds like. It sounds like a prayer that isn't a prayer, delivered by a man who couldn't tell the difference, to a room that recited it anyway, and nobody said a word. That's not a satire. That's a Tuesday.